This is the Utah Legislative Update, your source for policy information from Capitol Hill. KHQN 1480 Radio, Senator Neiderhauser. I'm here hosting Representative Ken Ivory, and we're having a great discussion on federalism. I wish we had some more time. My mind is just spilling over with some things we could talk about with this issue, because I believe it is the issue of our time, because if we don't get a handle on this, it will be detrimental to us going forward.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson made a great statement. He said, "We must strengthen the state governments. We can't do it by any change in the Constitution. It's the mere preservation of the Constitution we need to contend for. It must be the states themselves erecting barriers at the constitutional line that cannot be surmounted." And, you know, we have no one else to blame but ourselves. We have to learn what a state is. We have to make sure that our attorneys know what a state is. And then we have to act. That's what the Supreme Court said a year ago. States are separate, independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it.
So we have another question from a listener. We appreciate the questions today. What is the disparity between gifts from the Fed to the states? And I think that the individual mentioned PILT payments, and the potential income from the tax that might be generated from that land. And boy, I mean, that's a discussion we could almost spend a full hour on, correct?
Yeah, you really could.
But let's do a short answer at least at this point, and maybe we'll have some further discussions in another show.
Yeah, this is a big point. So to really understand what PILT is and what the transfer payments from the federal government to the states are with respect to the lands, you really have to go back to a little bit of history. The public land question predates the formation of our nation. It goes back to 1780, when they were in the middle of the Revolutionary War and they ran out of money. They said, what do we do now? And 7 states had claim to Western lands. 6 of them didn't. And the 7 states said, well, we'll just sell some of our claims to the Western lands. You 6, you go raise taxes on the original Tea Party crowd. Good luck. And they said, no, we're not going there. And there was such a contention in the middle of the Revolutionary War, if you can imagine, that they called it the Great Embarrassment. And so the Continental Congress stepped up and said, okay, we have the solution. Let us hold the land. And they said, no way, we're not creating another land baron. They said, no, let us hold the land in trust to create new states and use the proceeds to pay the debt. And that's where our Article 4 came from, that said Congress has the power to dispose of the land, not to keep it forever. The Constitution says they have the power to dispose of. So for 200 years, Congress knew that its duty was to dispose, to extinguish title. That's the language right in our Enabling Act. Well, we get to 1976, and we've lost touch with that history. We've forgotten all of that. They've been holding the land because it was dry, they said originally. It's harder to sell. Remember, their duty is to dispose, not sell. If they sell, great, but they have to dispose. So we get to 1976, and Congress says, never mind our constitutional obligation, we now have a policy that we're going to keep all these lands in federal ownership. But not to worry, we're going to give you a promise, because we're going to keep you from using your own lands and your own resources to educate your own children and care for your own communities. We're going to give you a promise called payment in lieu of taxes, PILT. 13 cents on the dollar to what the average taxable value would be. We'll also give you a promise, because we're not going to let you use your renewable forest resource, that the money for that was going right into schools. We're going to take your ability to use your forest resources and let all the fuel build up so that it burns, but we'll give you secure rural schools. Well, now what's happening under sequestration? They're cutting PILT, so the promise for
don't
not
count
using,
on that being a source of income, right?
Right. So
it's not in our control. It's out of our control. That's the problem.
Exactly. So the promise that was supposed to be sacred that they gave for not using our lands and resources in the first place, they're cutting that back under sequestration. The SRS, the Secure Rural Schools, not only are they cutting that going forward, they're reaching back in time and saying that money that you've already spent in your schools and communities, you have to pay that back to us. And then you've got federal mineral lease payments that if you're North Dakota, same terms of statehood, 5 years apart in statehood, they control 100% of the access to their resources. They get 100% of the mineral lease royalty. In Utah, we only get 48%, and now they're cutting that back as well.
Yeah, as they have to deal with a $17 trillion debt.
Exactly.
That's unsustainable. There's going to be some cuts, and it's going to be in these areas, and they'll be painful to a lot of situations here in Utah. We've got another question come in. This is a great question. Again, this might be a discussion for a whole program, or at least I have a program. What about state nullification? Is that a viable solution?
Okay,
And I've got a lot of, I've had done some research on this. So
yeah, I like the way that the United States Supreme Court said it a year ago. So rather excuse me, rather than going back to 1798 with the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions, let's go back a year to the United States Supreme Court, and it says, this is the United States Supreme Court, excuse me, they said, in the typical case, we look to the states to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding to federal blandishments, that's coaxing, coercing, cajoling, not yielding to federal blandishments when they do not want to embrace federal policies as their own. States are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it. Not ask like it, not litigate like it, act like it. Act in your jurisdiction. Protect and secure your jurisdictional line rather than having the federal government move that jurisdictional line, and that becomes the new status quo.
So I had a discussion with our U.S. Representative Rob Bishop recently. Well, it's been about 6 months ago. He had a discussion, I think, with Scalia, Justice Scalia, and complaining about the court not protecting the states more. The justice's response was, stop taking the money.
Right.
That is the root of our problem in the states, is we've gotten used to taking the money. And we're now faced here in our state with another question. Are we going to expand Medicaid? Are we going to take the money? And it's compelling because all the other states are taking the money, and this is where and that money isn't free. There's strings attached, right?
You know, it reminds me of, I believe it's the Odyssey, right? Homer, and they're going by the rocks and the sirens, and the siren song was so sweet. And he had them tie his hands to the mast, blindfold him, so that they would go by, because all of the ships would go to the siren song that sounded so sweet, and they would all crash on the rocks. Well, it's a false promise. The federal government's already broke, and they're getting broker by the day. And to think that that is the siren song that is going to fix everything, when there's no precedence of the federal government managing anything on that scale effectively, it really is a false promise.
Yeah, I agree completely. So I think suffice it to say on this question regarding the money or the taxes that might be generated from them, I think it would be a time. I mean, we need to have a more detailed discussion on this, but suffice it to say, what we're getting from the federal government today pales in comparison to what, with the lease payments and all those issues. We've actually been losing jobs to North Dakota in a world where capital moves where their return is. We're now losing jobs. We are now losing an industry that's moving to Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas, North Dakota, where it doesn't take 7 years, 10 years to get a lease or permit. It takes a week or a month.
Right.
And the revenues from that would be substantial for our schools here in Utah. So again, some things have happened. The 17th Amendment, some other things. What are some things that have actually been detrimental to the strength of the states over the last 150 years?
Yeah, you hit on a couple of the big ones. The 17th Amendment, that took away our direct representation as a state in Congress.
A state representation.
Right.
And that was important to the strength of the state and its jurisdiction.
So when you, as the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, we get the collective will of our body, and then we would instruct our senator, do this for our state, to preserve the jurisdiction and power of our state. Critical. But that's one of the 5 tools that we were given.
The House was to be the House of the voice of the people, and the Senate was the voice of the state.
Right, right, and so now those races cost so much money that the money comes from all over the nation, and the interest vying for any senator in any particular state, those interests are coming from all over the nation, and not Utah, and more recoverable oil than the rest of the world combined right here in Utah that the Government Accountability Office told us just last year. $150 trillion in mineral value locked up in the publicly controlled lands throughout the West that the Institute for Energy Research told us just 3 months ago. And then we've got a $2.6 billion education funding gap, $7 billion dependency with a $13 billion budget on federal funds. To have our champions taking direction from you, taking direction from the Speaker of the House, would be a much different situation than saying, oh, well, in the cocktail parties in Washington, they think that's crazy because they think the land's owned by everyone, and they don't know that Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas were in that situation. They don't know that the statehood promises are the same. It's just too hard. Well, we would get a new champion if our champions wouldn't stand up, because we understand the risk. We're going to have to educate children, take care of sick people, poor people, roads and public safety, no matter what continues to happen in Washington.
That's correct. So it's been a pleasure, Representative, to have you on here today. There are some things I think we could go into some more depth, and I hope that you'll be open to coming back to the show to discuss some of those things. Recently, I just want to mention in conclusion is that Bluffdale City actually passed a resolution in support of our lands, getting back our lands. So it isn't just your state legislator, it isn't just your U.S. representatives, but your local cities can pass a resolution, and we hope you will encourage all your officials to get involved in this issue, because it is the issue of our time. We appreciate you listening today, and we want to again thank Representative Ivory for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, President.